It started like any other ordinary Wednesday. My wife, Jessica, had mentioned in passing that she was meeting up with an old high school friend for lunch. I didn't think much of it at the time. Why would I? We'd been married for 10 years, had 2 kids, and I thought I knew everything about her. Jessica wasn't the type to keep secrets, or so I believed. Her old classmate was named Derek, someone she hadn't seen in years. According to Jessica, they were just friends back in high school, never dated, and hadn't kept in touch until recently. The tone in her voice was casual, almost dismissive when she brought him up. And I didn't want to be one of those paranoid husbands. We trusted each other, or at least I trusted her. That day, I came home from work a bit earlier than usual. I figured we could grab dinner together once she returned. But when I arrived, Jessica wasn't home. No big deal, I thought. Lunches can run late, especially if you're catching up after a long time. So, I waited and waited. The hours ticked by, and something began gnawing at me. A subtle unease I couldn't shake. She hadn't called, hadn't texted, and it was almost 7 p.m. I tried to rationalize the feeling away. Maybe they went for drinks after lunch, reminiscing about old times. Maybe she lost track of time. I grabbed my phone, texted her, and asked if everything was okay. No reply. The minutes stretched into an hour, and the silence from her end was deafening. It wasn't until almost 9 p.m. that she walked through the door. The moment I saw her, something felt off. Her hair was slightly tousled, her face flushed, not the way someone looks after a casual lunch. She smiled, but it was tight, forced. I asked her how the meetup went, and she answered quickly, almost too quickly. "Oh, it was good, you know. We talked about old times, caught up, nothing special." Then she brushed past me, saying she was tired and needed a shower. That should have been it. A normal husband might have accepted it and moved on, but something wasn't sitting right with me. My gut told me there was more to the story. The next few days, Jessica was quieter than usual, distracted even. I tried to bring up the lunch again, ask how Derek was doing, but she kept her answers short and vague. Then one night, as we lay in bed, I noticed she had a new habit, checking her phone constantly, even in the middle of the night. She would turn the screen away from me whenever a message came through, and each time, her face seemed tense. The cracks were starting to show, but I didn't want to believe it. We had built a life together, shared everything. I couldn't imagine her lying to me. I pushed the doubts aside, hoping it was all in my head. But those doubts didn't go away. They only grew. The following week, something shifted dramatically. She started dressing differently when she went out, putting more effort into her appearance. Tight jeans, freshly done hair, lipstick that hadn't seen daylight in months. "It's just for myself," she said when I asked about it. "I want to feel good." I smiled, but inside I felt the knot in my stomach tighten. Then, on a Friday evening, I came home early again, hoping to surprise her with takeout and a movie night. Her car wasn't in the driveway, and the house was eerily quiet. She hadn't mentioned going anywhere. My heart pounded as I dialed her number, but it went straight to voicemail. I tried again, but no answer. That familiar wave of unease crashed over me, harder this time. Desperate for answers, I checked her shared phone bill online, looking for any pattern. That's when I saw it, dozens of messages to an unfamiliar number, all within the past 2 weeks. My pulse quickened. I did a quick search, and sure enough, the number was registered to Derek. That night, she came home much later than usual, with no explanation. She seemed flustered when she saw me waiting in the living room, like she hadn't expected me to be up. My mind raced with a million thoughts, but I couldn't bring myself to confront her. Not yet. Instead, I waited, watching, observing, because deep down, I knew something was about to unravel. Something that would shatter the illusion of the life we had built. And I wasn't prepared for what came next. After that Friday, things began to spiral. It wasn't a sudden fall, but rather a slow, creeping shift in Jessica's behavior. A subtle distance started growing between us. She wasn't outright cold, but she wasn't as present as she used to be either. The little things started to add up. The absent-minded responses when we talked, the quick, almost dismissive kisses goodbye, the way she'd stay glued to her phone in the evenings, smiling at texts I wasn't supposed to see. The worst part? I couldn't shake the image of Derek from my mind. I had never met the guy, but I imagined him constantly. Was he tall? Better looking? More successful? My imagination filled in the gaps with worst-case scenarios. And with every unanswered question, the knot in my stomach tightened. One evening, we were supposed to have dinner together, just the two of us like we used to. I had been looking forward to it all day, thinking maybe we could reconnect, talk things through, or at least enjoy a quiet evening. But Jessica showed up late, nearly an hour after I had set the table. She didn't apologize, just muttered something about running into a friend at the store. That same uneasy smile played on her lips when she sat down, her mind clearly elsewhere. As we ate, I noticed her phone light up with a message. She quickly swiped it away, placing the phone face down on the table. But I'd already seen the name flash across the screen. Derek. My heart sank, and for the first time, I felt something I hadn't before. Anger. Real, burning anger. I tried to keep my voice calm, asking casually, "How's Derek doing these days?" Jessica looked up, her fork freezing halfway to her mouth. For a brief second, panic flickered across her face, but she quickly masked it. "He's good. We've only talked a few times since lunch," she said, brushing off the question like it didn't matter. But it did matter. It mattered more than anything. I couldn't let it go. "You've been talking to him a lot lately, haven't you?" I asked, my voice low but steady. Her eyes narrowed slightly, a flash of defensiveness sparking. "What are you getting at?" she asked, her tone growing sharper. She was on edge now, the calm facade slipping away. I stared at her, trying to find the right words. Should I confront her? Push her to admit what I already suspected? Or should I wait, gather more proof before making a move? My mind raced, torn between wanting to know the truth and dreading what that truth might be. "Nothing," I finally muttered, shaking my head. "Just curious." But the damage was done. The rest of the meal passed in tense silence, the unspoken accusations hanging in the air between us. That night, as Jessica slept beside me, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, my mind churning with possibilities. I thought back to when we first got married, how she used to look at me with such love and affection. Now, it felt like those moments were just memories, distant, faded echoes of something that had once been real. The next day, I made a decision. I needed to know the truth. Not just the half-truths and deflections Jessica had been feeding me, but the real, unfiltered truth. So, I did something I never thought I would, something that felt both shameful and necessary. While Jessica was in the shower, I grabbed her phone. My hands shook as I swiped through her messages. Most of it was harmless, casual conversations with friends and family. But then I found it a string of texts with Derek. At first, it didn't seem like much, just friendly banter, jokes about their high school days. But as I scrolled further back, the messages took a different tone. "I can't stop thinking about that day," he had texted. "Me neither." "It was unexpected," Jessica had replied. My heart pounded as I scrolled faster, piecing together the timeline. Their lunch hadn't been just lunch. Somewhere in between, something had happened. There was no explicit mention of it, but the subtext was clear. The playful flirting, the inside jokes, the occasional late-night messages. It all pointed to something more than friendship. Then I saw the message that sealed it. "We need to be more careful. I can't afford to slip up again." I put the phone down, my hands numb. There it was, the confirmation I had been dreading. Jessica had crossed a line, one she could never uncross. My mind reeled as I tried to make sense of it all. How long had this been going on? Was it just a one-time thing, or had it continued behind my back? I wanted to confront her right then and there, to throw the evidence in her face and demand answers. But something held me back. Maybe it was shock, or maybe it was fear. Fear of what would happen if I actually said the words out loud. I needed to think, to process what I had just learned. So, instead of confronting her, I left the house, saying I needed some air. I drove aimlessly, my thoughts spinning in 1,000 different directions. The betrayal felt like a physical weight pressing down on me, suffocating me. The worst part wasn't just the cheating. It was the lies, the deceit, the way she had looked me in the eye and pretended everything was fine. I had trusted her, loved her, built a life with her, and now it all felt like it was crumbling beneath me. As I drove, 1,000 questions ran through my mind. How had we gotten here? What had gone wrong? And most importantly, what was I going to do about it? I didn't have the answers yet, but one thing was clear. The life I thought I knew, the marriage I thought was solid, it was all hanging by a thread. And soon, that thread was going to snap. After that day, everything felt different. I couldn't look at Jessica the same way. Every time she smiled at me, I wondered if she had smiled at him like that. Every touch felt hollow. Every word tinged with suspicion. It was like a fog had settled over our marriage, thick and suffocating. And no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't see through it. But I couldn't just sit in silence forever. The tension in the house was becoming unbearable. Every interaction felt forced, fake, like we were playing roles in a life that no longer fit. I needed answers, real ones. I needed to know the truth straight from her mouth, not just through hidden messages on a phone. One night, after we had put the dishes away and the kids were asleep, I decided I couldn't wait any longer. I had to confront her. I sat across from her at the kitchen table, my heart pounding in my chest, and I blurted it out. "Jess, we need to talk." She looked up from her phone, her expression curious, maybe even a little nervous, like she already sensed where this was going. "About what?" she asked, trying to sound casual, but there was an edge to her voice, like she was bracing herself. I didn't beat around the bush. "About Derek." Her face went pale, and I saw her fingers tighten around her phone. For a moment, she didn't say anything, just stared at me, like she was deciding whether to lie or come clean. But I was done waiting for her to make up her mind. "I saw the messages," I said, my voice low but firm. "I know something happened between you two. I need you to be honest with me." Jessica blinked, her mouth opening and closing like she was searching for the right words, but none came. The silence stretched between us, thick and heavy, until finally she spoke. It wasn't what you think," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. I let out a bitter laugh, unable to believe she was still trying to minimize it. "Really? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you've been sneaking around with him behind my back." Her eyes welled up with tears, but I wasn't about to let that stop me. Not this time. I wanted the truth, all of it, and I wasn't going to let her hide behind her emotions. "We were just catching up," she stammered. "It wasn't supposed to go this far." "But it did, didn't it?" I pressed, leaning forward, my anger rising to the surface. "You crossed the line, Jess, and now you're sitting here, acting like it's no big deal." Tears spilled down her cheeks as she buried her face in her hands. "I didn't mean for this to happen," she cried. "It was a mistake, a stupid, horrible mistake." I stared at her, my chest tight with frustration and hurt. How could she be so reckless? How could she throw everything away like this? "Tell me everything," I demanded, my voice hard. "No more lies. No more half-truths. I need to know what really happened." She wiped her eyes and took a deep breath, her shoulders shaking as she tried to steady herself. "It started after that lunch," she admitted quietly. "We didn't plan it. We were just talking, reminiscing about high school, and I don't know. One thing led to another." My hands balled into fists under the table as she continued, her words like daggers piercing through me. "We didn't sleep together, not right away. It was just flirting at first. We met up a couple of times, talked, and then it happened." She paused, her voice cracking. "It was just one time. It was a mistake. I knew it was wrong, but I didn't stop it." I felt a cold chill run down my spine. My worst fears had been confirmed. The woman I had loved for years, the mother of my children, had betrayed me in the worst possible way. And it wasn't just the physical act. It was the emotional connection she had formed with him. The shared secrets, the hidden conversations, the intimacy they had stolen from me. "How long?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "A few months," she admitted, her face crumpling in guilt. "Months. Months of lies, months of deception, months of her sneaking around behind my back." It felt like the floor had dropped out from under me. Everything I thought I knew about my marriage, about her, was a lie. "Why?" I asked, my voice breaking. "Why him? Why now?" Jessica shook her head, her tears falling faster now. "I don't know," she sobbed. "I was lonely. We've been so distant lately, and Derek, he was there. He made me feel wanted again. But it doesn't mean I don't love you, I swear." I never wanted to hurt you. Love? I scoffed, the word tasting bitter on my tongue. You call this love? You betrayed me, Jess. You lied to me, and now you're sitting here asking for forgiveness. She reached across the table, her hand trembling as she tried to touch mine, but I pulled away, the hurt too raw, too fresh. I'm so sorry, she whispered. Please, I'll do anything to make it right. But the damage had been done. No matter how many times she apologized, no matter how many tears she shed, the trust between us had been shattered, and I didn't know if it could ever be rebuilt. I stood up, unable to stay in that room any longer. I need some time, I muttered, turning toward the door. I need to think. As I walked out of the house, leaving Jessica sobbing at the kitchen table, 1,000 thoughts raced through my mind. How had we gotten here? How had everything fallen apart so quickly? And more importantly, what was I going to do next? The night air was cold as I stepped outside, but it did little to calm the storm inside me. I had no answers, only questions. But one thing was certain, nothing would ever be the same again. The days that followed were a blur. I couldn't focus at work, couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I pictured Jessica with Derek, and the anger, the betrayal, hit me all over again like a punch to the gut. The person I had trusted with everything had stabbed me in the back in the most personal way possible. I spent hours driving aimlessly around town, trying to clear my head, but no matter where I went, the thoughts followed me. I'd end up parked outside a random convenience store or sitting in some empty parking lot, staring blankly ahead as memories of our life together flooded my mind. I couldn't stop thinking about all the little moments, the nights we spent laughing together, the way she'd curl up next to me on the couch, the warmth of her touch when she held my hand. I'd built my whole life around her, and now it felt like that life was crumbling right in front of me. Yet, despite everything, part of me still loved her. That was the hardest thing to accept. Even though she had ripped my heart out, I couldn't just shut off my feelings like a light switch. I wanted to hate her, but I couldn't. Love doesn't work like that. Jessica tried reaching out to me over the next few days, but I ignored her calls and texts. I wasn't ready to face her. Every message she sent, every apology she offered felt like salt in the wound. How could she expect me to forgive her so easily? Eventually, Katie, my sister, caught wind of what was going on. I hadn't told her, but she must have sensed something was wrong when I didn't show up to our usual family gatherings. One evening, she called me up and asked if I wanted to grab a beer, no pressure. Just to talk. I didn't want to unload my problems on anyone, but Katie had always been there for me, so I agreed. We met at a small dive bar we used to go to when we were younger, back when life seemed a lot simpler. As soon as I sat down, she gave me that look, like she knew exactly what had been eating away at me. She didn't ask right away, though. Instead, we just talked about random things, catching up like we always did. It wasn't until the second beer that she leaned in a bit closer, her voice quiet but firm. Okay, speed. What's going on with you? Katie asked, her eyes full of concern. I hesitated, unsure where to even begin. How do you explain the destruction of your marriage in a few sentences? But after a moment, I took a deep breath and told her everything about Derek, the texts, the betrayal, all of it. Katie listened without interrupting, nodding occasionally, but mostly just letting me talk. When I was done, she leaned back in her chair, shaking her head slowly. Wow, she said softly. That's rough. Yeah, I muttered, taking a long swig of my beer. It's a mess. What are you going to do? She asked. I shrugged, feeling that familiar knot tighten in my chest. I don't know. Part of me wants to pack up and leave, just get out of here. But another part of me, I don't know, Katie. I still love her, and I hate that I do. Katie was quiet for a moment. Then she reached across the table and grabbed my hand, giving it a reassuring squeeze. Listen, I can't tell you what to do, she said. But I know one thing. This isn't your fault. Don't blame yourself for what she did. People make choices, and she made hers. It's on her, not you. Her words hit me harder than I expected. I had been beating myself up for days, wondering if I had done something to push Jessica into Derek's arms, if I had somehow failed her. But hearing Katie say that, it felt like a weight was lifted off my shoulders. I know, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. But it still hurts like hell. Katie nodded, her expression softening. Of course it does, and it's going to for a while. But you've got to figure out what's best for you. Whether that's staying and working through it, or walking away, you need to do what's right for you, not just what's easiest. We sat in silence for a while after that, just sipping our drinks and letting the conversation hang in the air. Katie didn't push me for answers, didn't try to fix things for me. She just listened. And for the first time in days, I felt like I wasn't alone in this mess. After we left the bar, I drove home with a little more clarity, but no closer to a decision. Part of me still wanted to confront Derek, to make him feel the pain I was carrying. But I knew that wouldn't solve anything. It wouldn't change what had happened. It wouldn't bring back the trust that had been shattered between Jessica and me. When I got home, Jessica was sitting on the couch, her eyes red and swollen from crying. She looked up when I walked in, her face a mix of hope and fear. I could see the guilt written all over her, and for a split second, I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. "We need to talk," she said quietly, standing up and taking a step toward me. I stayed where I was, keeping the distance between us. "Yeah, we do." She nodded, her voice trembling as she spoke. I know I've hurt you, and I know saying sorry isn't enough. But I need you to know that I'll do whatever it takes to fix this. I'll go to therapy, we can do counseling, anything. Just please don't walk away." Her words hung in the air, heavy with desperation. But I wasn't ready to just forgive and forget. Not yet. Maybe not ever. "I don't know if this is something that can be fixed," I said, my voice cold. "You broke my trust, Jess. You went behind my back with someone I knew, someone we both knew. How do you expect me to just move past that?" Jessica's tears started again, but I held my ground. I wasn't going to let her emotions sway me this time. I needed time. I needed space. "I'm not leaving tonight," I said after a long pause. "But I don't know where we go from here. You need to give me time to figure this out." She nodded, wiping her eyes. "Okay," she whispered. "Take all the time you need. I'll be here waiting." With that, I walked past her and headed upstairs to the spare bedroom, closing the door behind me. I lay down on the bed, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing. What now? Could we ever get past this? Or was this the beginning of the end? One thing was clear. I wasn't ready to give up on my marriage. But I wasn't ready to forgive either. And somewhere, in the back of my mind, the image of Derek loomed like a dark cloud, reminding me that no matter what I chose, things would never be the same again. The days stretched on in a painful blur after that night. I'd sleep in the spare room, trying to distance myself emotionally. But no matter where I went, Jessica's betrayal weighed on my chest like a constant, suffocating pressure. I tried keeping busy, throwing myself into work, taking on more projects than I could handle, but even that wasn't enough to drown out the anger and confusion gnawing at me from the inside. Jessica, to her credit, gave me the space I'd asked for. She didn't push or demand answers. Instead, she kept to herself, still living under the same roof, but careful not to overstep. We moved like strangers sharing the same home, exchanging only the bare minimum words needed to navigate our days. There were times I could hear her crying softly in the living room, but I stayed in my room, letting the walls between us grow thicker. But no matter how much space I took, the questions still swirled in my mind. Why had she done it? Why with Derek? Was there something missing between us that I hadn't seen? Something I failed to give her? That's the thing about betrayal. It makes you question everything, even the parts of your life you thought were solid. And no matter how much I tried to rationalize it, I couldn't shake the thought that maybe, deep down, I hadn't been enough. And then there was Derek. The rage I felt toward him was a different kind of fire. It simmered low, threatening to explode with every passing day. It wasn't just that he had slept with my wife. It was the fact that he'd smiled in my face for years, pretending to be a friend. The thought of confronting him burned inside me, but I kept pushing it down, knowing that if I did, there'd be no going back. It was a couple of weeks after that initial revelation that I finally hit my breaking point. I'd spent too many nights lying awake, replaying the same scenarios over and over in my head. Jessica's betrayal, Derek's smug face, the memories of what our marriage used to be. I couldn't keep living in limbo, not knowing what direction to take. It was eating me alive. So one morning, After another sleepless night, I got up and grabbed my keys. I didn't tell Jessica where I was going. Didn't even look back as I left the house. I knew exactly what I needed to do. I drove straight to Derek's place. It was a small apartment on the other side of town, the kind of place you rent when you're drifting through life without any real responsibilities. My hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as I pulled up to the curb. For a long moment, I just sat there, staring at his door, wondering if I was about to make the biggest mistake of my life. But then I thought about everything. Jessica's tearful confession, the years of lies, the trust that had been shattered. And I knew there was no turning back. I got out of the car, my footsteps heavy as I made my way to his door. Each step felt like a release, like I was finally letting go of all the anger I had been holding inside. When I reached his door, I didn't hesitate. I pounded on it hard, making the walls shake. It took a few seconds before Derek answered. And when he did, the look on his face was priceless. Shock, fear, guilt, it was all there, written in the way his eyes widened as he saw me standing in front of him. For a split second, I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. "We need to talk," I said, my voice cold, not leaving room for argument. Derek swallowed hard, stepping aside to let me in. I could tell he was nervous, unsure of what was about to happen. He should have been. I stepped inside, feeling the tension in the air. The small apartment felt even smaller now, the walls closing in on us as I stood there, looking at the man who had wrecked my marriage. For a moment, neither of us said anything. The silence was heavy, thick with all the unspoken words between us. "So, I guess you know," Derek finally said, his voice shaky. I didn't respond right away. I just stared at him, letting the weight of my anger fill the room. Then slowly I nodded. "I know everything," I said quietly. "Jessica told me. About you. About all of it." Derek winced, running a hand through his hair, clearly uncomfortable. "Look, man, I didn't mean for things to get out of hand. It just happened." I felt a surge of anger rise up in my chest, but I forced myself to stay calm. "It just happened?" I repeated, my voice cold. "You slept with my wife, Derek. This wasn't some accident. You knew exactly what you were doing." He opened his mouth to respond, but I cut him off. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" I demanded, stepping closer to him. "You've destroyed my marriage. You've ruined everything I've built with Jessica. And for what? A cheap fling?" Derek's face turned pale, and he took a step back, clearly shaken by the intensity of my words. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I really am. I never wanted to hurt you, man." I shook my head, disgusted. Sorry isn't good enough. For a moment, I stood there, my fists clenched at my sides, ready to knock him out. But then something shifted inside me. The anger I'd been holding on to for so long suddenly felt pointless. Derek wasn't worth it. None of this was worth it. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to step back. "You're not worth it, Derek," I said quietly. "I'm done." With that, I turned and walked out of his apartment, leaving him standing there in stunned silence. As I drove away, I felt an odd sense of relief wash over me. Confronting Derek hadn't solved anything, but it had given me a sense of closure I hadn't expected. When I got home, Jessica was waiting for me. She looked at me with wide eyes, as if she knew where I had been. I didn't say anything, just walked past her and went upstairs to pack a bag. It was time for me to go. Not forever, just for a while. I needed space. I needed time to think, to process everything. I didn't know what the future held for us, but one thing was clear. I wasn't going to live in the shadow of betrayal anymore. It was time to take control of my life again. Whether that meant moving forward with Jessica or without her, I didn't know yet. But for the first time in weeks, I felt like I had a choice. And that, at least, was something. Leaving that house felt like tearing away from everything I once knew. I packed my bag in silence, not knowing where I was headed, but knowing I couldn't stay. Jessica stood at the bottom of the stairs, watching, but neither of us said much. There were no more words to cover the damage done. The betrayal was raw, and space was the only thing I could offer her, or myself. The image of her and Derek together haunted me as I drove aimlessly through the night. I replayed our confrontation over and over, wondering if I should have hit him, let my anger explode in one violent release. But I hadn't. Instead, I was left with the quiet hum of the engine and the ache of a life torn apart. Eventually, I ended up at a rundown motel on the outskirts of town, a place as broken and tired as I felt. I checked in, not caring about the state of the room or the dingy bed. Lying there, staring at the ceiling, I couldn't stop my thoughts from spiraling. How had it come to this? How did I go from having a seemingly perfect life to being alone in a place like this, with my marriage on the brink of collapse? Sleep didn't come easily, and when it did, it was filled with restless dreams that made no sense, memories and emotions crashing over me. I woke the next morning to a message from Jessica. 2 words that summed up everything. I'm sorry. It didn't make the pain any less real, but it did remind me that I wasn't the only one hurting. I stayed in that motel for days, trying to make sense of what to do next. Each day passed in a blur, walking through town, trying to clear my mind, but the weight of everything followed me no matter how far I went. Every step was a reminder of the life I was leaving behind, and the decision I knew I had to make. On the 3rd day, I realized I couldn't keep running forever. It was time to face the wreckage. So, I packed my things, left the motel, and headed back to the home I wasn't sure I'd ever feel a part of again. The road ahead was uncertain, but staying in limbo wasn't an option anymore. When I returned home, the house was quiet. Too quiet. The kind of stillness that hangs heavy in the air, making everything feel off. I walked inside, half expecting Jessica to be gone, her things packed up and the house empty. But there she was, sitting at the kitchen table, staring at a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. She looked up when I entered, her face pale and drawn, eyes red from crying. I didn't say anything at first. I just stood there, the weight of everything hanging between us like an invisible barrier. There was a tension in the air, as if the house itself knew the gravity of what we were about to face. Part of me wanted to demand answers, to lay into her with every ounce of anger still simmering beneath the surface. But another part of me, the part that was exhausted from days of thinking, just wanted to understand how we had gotten here. I don't know what to say, she finally whispered, her voice barely audible. I don't even know how to start. I stood there, taking in the sight of her, trying to reconcile the woman I loved with the one who had betrayed me. It felt surreal. How did we go from being a couple planning our future to this? To standing on the edge of a cliff, one wrong move away from everything collapsing for good? I didn't come back to hear more excuses. I said, my voice steady but strained. I came back because I need to figure out if there's anything left between us. Anything worth salvaging. Jessica's eyes filled with tears, but she nodded. I don't expect you to forgive me, she said quietly. Her voice cracked. I just don't want to lose everything. Not like this. The words stung. It wasn't just about her betrayal anymore. It was about the life we had built together, the memories, the history, the years we had shared. Could all of that really be undone by a single mistake? Or had this been building up, layer by layer, for years without me even noticing? We sat in silence for what felt like hours. Both of us too drained to say much, but both knowing the storm was far from over. I wanted to believe that we could work through it, that somehow we could find a way back to each other. But the reality was, I didn't know if I could ever look at her the same way again. Trust once shattered is hard to rebuild, and without it, what was left? I need time, I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. I need time to figure out what this all means. For us. For me. She nodded again, tears streaming down her face, but she didn't say anything. Maybe she knew there was nothing more to be said. The next steps were uncertain, but for now, it was clear that we both had a long road ahead. As I left the room, the weight of the past week settled over me like a heavy blanket. The future was uncertain, and the path ahead was anything but clear. But one thing was certain, we couldn't go back to the way things were. Too much had been broken. The only question now was whether we could rebuild from the wreckage, or if we'd be left standing in the ruins of what once was. The days following that conversation blurred together. I stayed out of the house more often than not, finding excuses to be anywhere but home. Work became my escape, but even there, I couldn't avoid the constant replay of what had happened. Jessica's betrayal lingered in my mind like a bad dream, one I couldn't shake no matter how hard I tried. At night, the house felt even more suffocating. The air seemed thick with unspoken words, and every time I saw Jessica, I could feel the weight of her guilt pressing down on both of us. We lived in the same space, but it felt like we were worlds apart. Neither of us knew how to bridge the gap. Maybe neither of us could. One evening, about a week after our last conversation, I found myself walking through the neighborhood, hoping that the cool evening air might clear my head. But nothing seemed to work. The quiet streets only reminded me of the silence that had settled between Jessica and me. A silence that had once been comfortable, familiar, now felt like a gaping wound that refused to heal. When I returned home that night, Jessica was in the living room, curled up on the couch. She looked up as I walked in, her eyes searching mine for some kind of signal, some sign that things might be okay again. But I had none to give. "We can't keep going like this," I said, standing in the doorway. My voice sounded foreign to me, detached, distant. Jessica sat up, her face pale and drawn. "I know," she whispered, "but I don't know what else to do." There was the honesty, the vulnerability that had been missing for so long. For the first time in days, I saw a flicker of the woman I had fallen in love with. But that flicker was small, and I wasn't sure if it was enough to reignite what we had lost. "I don't either," I admitted, running a hand through my hair. "I don't know what the right answer is here." Jessica stood up and took a tentative step toward me. "Do you still love me?" she asked softly, her voice breaking on the last word. The question hit me like a punch to the gut. Love. The one thing that had once felt so certain now felt complicated, messy. Did I still love her? Could I still love her after what had happened? "I don't know," I said, my voice raw. "I don't know if love is enough anymore." Her face crumpled, and I saw her wipe a tear from her cheek. "I can't undo what I did," she said, her voice barely audible. "But I'll spend the rest of my life trying to make it right if you'll let me." The desperation in her voice tugged at something deep inside me. But it wasn't enough to erase the hurt. Love couldn't just erase betrayal, no matter how much either of us wanted it to. "I need space," I finally said, my words heavy with finality. "I need to figure out what I want, and you need to figure out what you really want too." Jessica nodded, though I could see the pain in her eyes. She didn't argue, didn't plead. She just stood there, as if she knew there was nothing more to be said. That night, I packed a bag and left. Not forever. At least I didn't think so. But I needed time away from the house, from her, from everything. I needed to breathe, to think, to feel something other than anger and confusion. As I drove away, the streets blurred in front of me, but my mind was clearer than it had been in days. The road ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear. Whatever happened next would change everything. There was no going back now. I stayed at that hotel for a few more days, letting the space and silence help me process everything that had happened. I didn't reach out to Jessica. I didn't respond to her texts or calls. I needed time away from the noise, from the weight of it all, to truly figure out what I wanted. Each morning, I woke up with the same ache in my chest, the same heavy fog hanging over me. Jessica's betrayal was like a wound that refused to heal, and I couldn't figure out how to move forward. Forgiveness, as much as people preached it, seemed so far out of reach. But during those long, quiet days, something started to shift. I began to realize that the answers I was looking for weren't just about Jessica's infidelity or what she had done to our marriage. It was deeper than that. I had spent years building my life around her, making compromises, ignoring red flags, and, most of all, losing parts of myself in the process. By the end of the week, I knew I had a decision to make. One that wasn't just about saving the marriage or walking away. It was about reclaiming my life. I couldn't keep living in the shadow of Jessica's betrayal, holding on to the hope that things could go back to the way they were. Because they couldn't. I had to accept that. I drove back to the house, knowing full well that this might be the last time I stepped through that door as her husband. The thought was both terrifying and freeing. When I walked in, Jessica was sitting at the kitchen table, her face pale and her eyes swollen from crying. She looked up when I entered, her breath catching in her throat, clearly unsure of how this was going to go. The weight of everything hung between us, unspoken, but undeniable. "I'm glad you came back," she said quietly, her voice trembling. I nodded, feeling the tension in the air. I wasn't here to fight. I wasn't here to scream. I had come to lay everything out, to put an end to the uncertainty, one way or another. "Jessica," I began, my voice steady but firm, "we need to talk. And I need you to hear me." She nodded, wiping her eyes and sitting up straighter, as if bracing herself for the inevitable. "I've had a lot of time to think over the last few days," I continued, "and I've realized something. What you did, it broke something in me. Not just the trust, but something deeper. I spent so long trying to make this work, ignoring signs, pushing down my own doubts because I believed in us. But I can't do that anymore. I can't pretend like this didn't happen." Jessica's face crumpled, tears spilling down her cheeks. "I know I hurt you. I know I ruined everything, but please, please don't give up on us. I'll do anything to fix this, anything to make it right." Her desperation hit me hard, but it wasn't enough to change my mind. I had made my decision. "It's not about giving up," I said softly. "It's about being honest with myself. I can't forgive this. I can't go back to the way things were, and I don't want to live in a marriage where trust is broken beyond repair. It's not fair to either of us." The silence that followed was deafening. Jessica's tears came harder, but this time, I didn't feel the urge to comfort her. The weight had shifted. For the first time, I wasn't the one grasping to hold things together. "I'm filing for divorce," I said, my voice calm but resolute. "I've already spoken to a lawyer. I'll make sure things are handled fairly, and we can go through this as amicably as possible. But we're done, Jessica. I can't do this anymore." She sobbed, covering her face with her hands. And though it hurt to see her like that, I knew this was the right decision. I had to walk away from the pain, from the betrayal, and start over. For myself. After a few minutes, she composed herself enough to speak. "I never wanted this to happen," she whispered. "I never wanted to lose you." I nodded, understanding that her regret was real. But it didn't change the reality of what had been done. "I know," I said, "but some things can't be undone." The rest of the conversation was short. There wasn't much more to say. I told her I'd be moving out, that I'd give her time to figure out where she wanted to live or if she wanted to sell the house. It wasn't a bitter exchange. It was just the end of something that had been broken for far too long. As I packed my bags and walked out of the house, I felt a strange sense of peace wash over me. It wasn't relief, exactly. There was still sadness, still a deep ache in my chest, but it was a step toward healing. A step toward reclaiming the parts of myself I had lost along the way. In the months that followed, the divorce process was as smooth as it could be. We divided our assets fairly, and Jessica moved out of the house. We didn't keep in touch after that, and I never asked about her old classmate or what became of them. That part of my life was closed now. And as for me, I began to rediscover who I was outside of the marriage, outside of the betrayal. It wasn't easy, but it was necessary. Little by little, I rebuilt my life, learning to trust myself again, learning to live for me. In the end, walking away from Jessica wasn't just about leaving her behind. It was about finding myself again. And that was a journey worth taking.